do I ask? How? How can we do this differently this time on Howard the Humongous? Okay, the Xbox 4 and the new Sony PlayStation have come out. And instead of costing $300 or whatever the old machines cost, they're going to cost $500. And a lot of parents are going to bellyache. And they're going to say, and a lot of, us pundits are going to bellyache too. And we're going to say, what the hell are we spending all this money for? Why are we wasting all this money? These kids are going to play their brains out instead of doing their homework. They won't even go out and play basketball or baseball with each other anymore. They won't even talk to anybody anymore. They'll simply be glued to their games. That's what destroys the minds of kids. Destroys their minds. Okay, I got news for you. People have been saying this about new cultural inventions since the days of Plato. Once upon a time, Plato was scared to death that a new invention, a new information technology invention, we're going to get the makeup lady here and there, swab down my upper lip. All right, that a new information technology invention was about to destroy the minds of kids. This is approximately 400 BC, 430 BC, to be a little bit more precise. A long time ago, right? What technology did he know was going to produce idiocy in Greece? Well, up until then, there were two major books in Greek literature that formed the Greek character. And every child was required to memorize them from beginning to end. They were these two books by Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And all of a sudden, some loonies, some techno-geeks from Byblos, had come up, Byblos, it's in Philistine territory, had come up with an idea of writing the books down on great big long sheets of parchment and rolling them up. They called them, because they came from Byblos, they called them, well, that's what they call our bibliography. They called them books. Books are going to destroy the minds of kids. Have books destroyed the minds of kids? No, far from it. Instead of filling your brain with only 2 books, now you could have 20 books. Now you could read 200 books. Now you could have a library in Alexandria 100 years later that was filled with thousands of books. Now you could have scholars who spent their entire lives reading the thousands of books and trying to translate them in some form to others who didn't have time to spend their entire lives reading the thousands of books. Going from 2 books to thousands of books, was that a dumbing down of Greek civilization or a smartening up? I have to leave the answer up to you. In the I always get it mixed up whether it was the 1570s or the 1670s. At any rate, there was this new thing in England. It was, in a sense, it was a new amusement. A new information technology, but information technology is an amusement technology. At least that's what I'm claiming in the process of giving you this information. The town fathers of London knew exactly what it would do to kids. It would pervert them utterly. It was selling sex and violence. And if you wanted to save the minds of kids, you better damn well stop it. And they did. They got together and they passed a law that said this stuff was what it should be, illegal. But there was a fan of this peculiar form of amusement. She lived in a palace. Her name was Queen Elizabeth. And she didn't want to ban it because if it were banned, she couldn't get to see it. And she said no to the ban. It was called theater. And the leading theater owner and playwright was named William Shakespeare. When we give our kids Shakespeare to read today, do we know that we're perverting them and we're dumbing them down? Or do we think that we are smartening them up? Things that are amusements for the mind look frivolous and vain. They look consumerist. They look like gross wastes of time. But they're not. And in fact, some of the 7 deadly sins are among the biggest virtues we've got. And they include, well, today's way of putting it is consumerism. They include video games. They include vain display. They include frivolity. Now, what the hell do I mean? Back in the 19th century, chemistry was being born. And 92 elements were being discovered, and their properties were being weighed and balanced and analyzed, and people were trying to figure out the explanation for why properties seemed to fall into certain kinds of families and how you could make sense of all of this. It was a huge puzzle, and there was nothing that seemed to really get a hold of it, nothing at all. But there was a Russian scientist who spent an inordinate amount of time at a frivolous, vain waste of time. A game, the equivalent of a video game of the time, a game that took advantage of a technology not of electrons, as in electronics, but of printing, cards. He played obsessively a game called solitaire. Suddenly, he got an idea one day, while all of the great minds of Europe were busy puzzling over this problem of the elements. What if I write the properties of the elements down on cards and lay them out the way I do on a table in a game of solitaire? And he did. And his name was Dmitri Mendeleev. And the result was something called the periodic table, the first thing that made sense out of the elements. There was a woman named Grace Hooper in the mid-20th century. And she, too, wasted a lot of her time. Why? Unlike most women of her day, she liked to play basketball. She really liked to play basketball. There were these brand new things that the government was putting a lot of money into to do the kind of number crunching it takes to figure out how to aim an artillery piece. You know, if you're going to aim an artillery piece, it's going to go a mile or two. You have to do some very careful calculations so that you can get it to go up and then down and land in the right place no matter what the wind or other problems are. Tons of calculations. And if you're going to fire guns from airships, from planes that are moving at 400 miles an hour, it gets even more complicated. There used to be these vast numbers of women, mostly, who did computations. And it would take them months of working on computations to solve a kind of problem we're accustomed to solving today in less than half a second. And these people were called, these women sitting at the tables, toiling away at equations, were called computers. And a bunch of Americans and Brits came up with the idea of using electronic gizmos to do the computing. But the problem was that when they built their first computers, their computers worked on something called machine language, which was very, very complex. So complex that even the greatest brains of the day couldn't talk directly to a computer. So they invented a language that the great brains of the day could talk. That was programming language. But somehow you had to translate from programming language to the language the machine understood. Machine language. You needed something that in those days was called a compiler. Well, who went to work on the problem of the compiler? Grace Hooper. And Grace Hooper was trying to figure out how to get this damn thing to work, and it just wouldn't. Until suddenly she remembered what it was like in basketball, when you had the ball, to be anticipating the moves of the 4 other players and figure out which player you wanted to pass to next and how to get the ball to that player. So it would be in the spot where that player was at the very instant the player was there to catch it. And she used the same principle for her computer programming, her programming of the compiler. And modern computing was up and on its feet, thanks to Grace Hooper. Then in the 1970s, computers had become more common. A friend of mine named Gary Marcus was playing, it was 1982, he was playing with a thing called a Commodore 64. It was a little box about like this, but a kid could afford it. You could afford a toy computer of your own. You could hook it up to the television set. and use it. Gary was so obsessed with this that he spent his whole childhood programming that computer. He eventually decided to go into psychology. And in psychology, because he'd grown up programming computers, he thought of the brain as a computer, and he looked for the programs in the brain. And he helped found a new field called cognitive psychology. The games we play make the breakthroughs that we make as adults. And we could go through thousands of other examples of materialism, consumerism, waste, and vain display. The pyramids, 4,000 years ago, set a new standard for how humans could work together and for the level of human aspiration and for what a state could accomplish if it put its mind to it. And Egypt lives off the pyramid industry today. Egypt lives off the tourist industry. Those frivolous wastes of time, those materialist piles of rock, have been inspiring people for 5,000 years. The cathedrals, which were built around 1150 AD and were the first worship places to allow in massive quantities of light, to show mankind that worship was not a matter of hiding in darkness against the fires of hell, that you could aspire to the sky. Those vain wastes, because they were materialist piles of, they were vain displays. They were the vanity of a town on display in a way that no town had previously in Europe displayed its vanity before. They were displays of wealth. That's consumerism. That's materialism. But they raised a level of aspiration and lifting your eyes from the darkness to the light that brought us the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So those things that look frivolous and vain, the Xboxes. The Xbox is going to introduce all kinds of new things to the life of kids. The Kinect that responds to your body, kids are not going to expect switches to stay on walls anymore. They're going to expect the things in their house to respond to them directly. That's how they're going to grow up. And when they design things, they're not going to design things so that you have to cross the room or cross the street or go across town to accomplish something anymore. They're going to design things so they respond to your body. You know what that does? That frees up the human mind and human time to do far more creative, amazing, astonishing things. In the Xbox, in the new PS4, are the seeds of a future beyond your imagining and mind. And we have to be not as stupid as Plato, not as stupid as the town fathers of London. We have to realize that every time we come up with one of these supposedly vain amusements, we are coming up with new levels of fantasy and reality for human culture and the human mind. This is Howard the Humongous speaking to you from the future. It is your job and my job to make